television.
Lord Monckton, you've been here in the United States providing lectures at universities, and as recent as last Thursday, you provided a slide presentation to the California General Assembly in which not a single Democrat bothered to show up. Tell us about your U.S. tour and your impression of Americans, especially our students, and their perception of global warming.
Let's start with the State Assembly in California, in Sacramento. There was one Democrat who did come. A rather unusual man, I suppose one would call him a blue dog, Senator Wright, who comes from a solidly working class urban district in central Los Angeles, who had to fight or run when he was a kid. You had to do one or the other, and sometimes both. He came up the hard way, and he knows how difficult it is for working people to make ends meet, bring up their families in the kind of ghastly public school system and the ghastly welfare system, which demeans those who use it while at the same time providing them with the necessaries of life. And he made quite a long intervention, making it quite clear that he had studied the global warming issue, had understood it to a considerable depth, and he even lectured me on one or two points about it. He said I should have included them in my presentation. I was very careful not to answer back, because of course you only get half an hour in front of a legislature, so you can't put in the baby as well as the bathwater. It's one or the other. But he was very impressive, and there were also several Republicans there, and they of course are now taking much more of an interest in this, realizing that neither does the science stack up nor does the economics stack up. As for the students I've met, I suppose the most interesting meeting was at the Union College in Schenectady, upper New York State, where a very large turnout came, 150 people crammed into the lecture theatre. Perhaps it was closer to 200. Most of them were hostile to the point of view I was expressing. And there were some very angry, but largely ill-directed questions from 4 professors and several PhDs who had come along with the students, clearly with the aim of simply giving me the hardest time they could. And I think it's fair to say they didn't really succeed in landing a blow between them. And then they held a counter meeting in another lecture hall at which 60 people came. They were rather disappointed that my meeting had attracted more people than theirs had. At which they had charts and graphs showing everything with the vertical aspect exaggerated to the point of unreason, showing temperatures increasing, sea level rise, etc., etc. All of it very carefully cherry-picked to make the worst possible impression. And I suppose the most interesting moment of the lot was when I had shown, as I usually do in my presentations, the bogus graph from the IPCC's 2007 report, which quite incorrectly purports to show that the rate of warming is itself accelerating and that we are to blame. And I always demonstrate that this is a bogus technique, and by various methods I show that it's beyond question a bogus technique. There's really no argument about it, it's simply wrong. And so then, when the professor was trying to sum up their meeting, at which I had stuck up my hand and made a number of tiresome interventions, quoting scientific papers that none of them had obviously read, but giving a completely different gloss on the particular subjects they were talking about, eventually the professor rather lost his temper, and he said, look, he said, the fact is, you haven't really made out a case there's anything wrong with this. I said, yes, I have. Just take that one example of the bogus graph. I said there were several other examples of bogus graphs from the IPCC's documents, but that was one which anyone without any mathematical training at all could see was bogus once it was explained to them. So he turned to his students and said, hands up all those who agree with me that that graph was just fine. And 2/3 of the hands in the room went up. So I said, how many of those who have put their hands up are statisticians? I thought, right, if they can endlessly appeal to authority, I'll do the same game and see what happens. one hand went up halfway and came back down again, because the guy realized that if, as a statistician, he was trying to lend his name to a graph which he could see perfectly well was bogus, this would all be on television, and he would never really live it down. He had simply lied. So I then rounded on the professor and said, you shouldn't have done that. And then I turned to the students and I said, you should not have put your hands up. Every single one of you knows that that graph was wrong. But in deference to authority, you voted the way your professor wanted you to vote. Never do that again, I said. Science is about the pursuit of truth. And if you lie, then, for one thing, you can see just how hollow any notion of consensus is. If I were to take the number of people in this room, the number of people who voted that the graph was okay, there's a consensus that it was okay, when in fact it wasn't. And I said, this is the trouble. True science, which means independent checking and thinking, has been replaced by globalized groupthink. And you have abandoned and spat upon the very education that you ought to have been given here. By thinking like a herd in deference to the authority of your professor, whom you knew to be wrong, when you should have had the guts and the independence of mind to vote for yourselves and for the truth. And you could have heard a pin drop of young faces, bright red, hung with shame, all around the room. So I think a lot of these students are not being properly taught. As a result, they are thinking like, I call them the Borg. You're not perhaps a Trekkie, but in Star Trek there is an alien race known as the Borg, who are effectively a kind of hive mind. And once you are assimilated into the Borg, you can no longer think for yourself. You think only with the mind of the hive, and you do what the Queen Bee wants you to do. And you become effectively no better than a robot. So I call these folk on the environmental hard left the Borg, because they don't care what is true and what is not in science or about global warming. Once they're told what the party line is, and they will call that the consensus rather than admitting it's the party line handed down by the central committee of the hive. Once they're told what the party line is, they turn off what little brains they may have, for if they had any, they wouldn't be part of the hive mind. And they stop thinking, and they actually become offended and angry if anyone says, hang on a moment, guys, the party line doesn't make any sense at all. It's just like that wonderful moment in 1984, where, by George Orwell, where the Communist Party orator is spouting the party line, the consensus, angrily and attacking those who oppose it. A note is handed up to him, announcing that the party line has changed by 180 degrees. And in mid-sentence, he begins attacking everything he has said previously in that speech, and says the precise opposite. And nobody in the audience bats an eyelid. That's where we are now with a lot of American education. It's very dangerous, and if it is not reversed, that's the end of the United States and this upcoming generation, who have been taught in this fashion, simply to parrot the party line rather than thinking independently for themselves. They have nothing to contribute, and their nation has no future.
The television